Hello, I'm Jacqueline King. Welcome to my sewing space. I'm here to encourage and inspire the new or frustrated sewer. If you were with us on the first episode, you know that I demonstrated how to have a certain pattern. That is a pattern that when cut and sewn together would be certain to fit your body. Today we're going to pick up on that. I have my Sacco fabric that I chose for myself, and we're going to get into cutting and prepping to put it all together. Probably not going to finish it in this episode, but just stick with me. I think you're going to enjoy. Let's get ready to cut. Folding our fabric together lengthwise so that right sides are touching. Take one of your largest pieces. You always want to begin with the large pieces to make sure you're going to have enough fabric when you're done. Lay your pattern on straight of grain. And as for the darts, I go a little bit wide because I know I can always adjust my fit through them. I can take it in easily. As you see me cut, you'll notice that I cut slightly outside of my shirt pattern. That's because I'm very familiar. I've used it a lot of times and I know what I need to add to get the proper seam allowance. Now, I'm not using pins because generally speaking, cloth does not slip on cloth. When you have tissue paper, that's when you get all kinds of sliding around and you'll want a lot of pins. But on this, you just lay it on, adjust it, it stays pretty good. It also speeds up the process because you're not using so many pins. When you've cut out your first piece, you're going to rinse and repeat. Take your other large bodice section, fold your fabric in half, lay it on, and cut. If you don't have darts, by the way, then you don't need to even think about that. I like a dart because it just adds to the fit. For our smaller pieces, it's easier to just cut a small chunk of fabric and work separately. You'll notice that I am again cutting outside, adding my seam allowance. The collar and collar band are laid on the fold of the fabric. This is only half of each, so when you fold it, you end up with a complete piece, and you're going to need a top and bottom on each. Also, you'll notice that I'm not cutting with the right side of the fabric in, and that's because I don't need to mark anything on this. As I cut along the top of the collar band, I'm squaring it off instead of the original rounding, and that's just a style choice. You can play with your patterns after you get familiar with them and make subtle changes like that to suit your own style. For my collar pieces, we're going to need interfacing. I prefer a light cotton gauze instead of a fusible interfacing. Okay, when I cut my interfacing, you'll notice that I'm overcutting, and that's fine. It's actually easier to line all your pieces together if you don't fuss the fit of the interfacing. That's all going to be trimmed away later. Same thing for the collar band. Just trim along, overcut it, and it'll all make sense when we're at the sewing machine. Now, when it comes to marking our darts, we do want to be accurate on this. This is a precise measurement to give us a precise fit. I'm drawing a center fold line in the center of the dart, and then simply tracing along one edge. That's all that's necessary, and though you might not understand what I'm doing, it'll make more sense when we go to the sewing machine. Once I do that, I trace, just transfer that center mark on the back side, and now with a few strategically placed pins, I'm going to be able to transfer those marks to the other side. Remember, we've got 2 darts on the back of the shirt. Flip it over, find your pins, transfer your marks. If you're a beginner and a little uncertain of your skill, you'll want to trace a line between those pin points. That's going to be your stitch line. It's slightly curved, so don't use one fell swoop on the outer edge. There's your fold. And your marks are transferred. The back is ready to stitch. So ready to press our front opening. Place your pins, use the original creases and folds of your pattern as a guide. And all I do is put a couple of pins at the top of the fold. I eyeball it when I press, but you can draw a line with your marker if you need to do that. That's perfectly fine. Anything that it takes to keep from making mistakes. So taking one off of the other, I now know the width that I'll be folding and pressing my front button band. One will be a button band, one will be the buttonholes. Now this will not be interfaced because you'll see we're going to fold it again. And with a double layer of fabric in there, that'll work fine for interfacing on the buttonholes. There you go. You're just doubling it over. Well, whatever you need to do on your pattern, this is how mine works. It's just a double fold the same width. Fold it and then fold again. And my front bands are ready. Of course, you'll want to do both sides, and if you're using an invisible marker, be careful of those dart marks. You put that hot iron over them, they're gone. Okay, with our front bands pressed, we're going to prep our seam allowance. At the shoulders and the sides, turn a scant 1/8 of an inch of fabric. You can do this with your fingers and without measuring. Just turn it and press. Give a little shot of steam. And again, you're going to see the beautiful seam finish you get with this. All right, who's ready to sew? I thought we'd start by me giving you my top 5 reasons of why I sew, and maybe it'll inspire you. Number 5, it's fun. Number 4, it's satisfying. Number 3, it saves you money. Number 2, I can make money. And number 1, and my favorite reason, it's biblical. If you didn't know, there is sewing in the Bible. Let me read to you one of my favorite passages. Actually, I'm not going to read the whole passage. I'll read the verse in the book of Acts, chapter 9. And there is a woman who has passed away, and her friends are distraught, and they send for one of the disciples. And I'm going to pick it up and just read the one verse. And this moves me every time I read it. In Acts chapter 9, verse 39, then Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and the garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. And I remember the first time that I really got that verse, and the whole scene played out in my mind. A woman has passed away, and obviously she was very beloved. There were people weeping for her, and I'm not sure if they knew what they were looking for when they sent for Peter, but Peter, they knew that the disciples were nearby, and Peter came. And when he came, and she was laid out, she was gone. And they were displaying everything she had made with her hands. And I have to believe they were things that they were wearing. Maybe gifts, or maybe she did it for a living. But they were so moved by what she had created with her hands. Well, the story goes on to say that Peter put everyone out of the room, and he spoke to the woman and told her to arise. And she came back to life. Now, there's obviously a whole lot more in that story to talk about, but today I just want to show you how beautiful it is that that was put, that when when God inspired the writing of this book, he didn't have to put all that detail in there, but he did. And so I have to think that that matters to him. In fact, I know it does matter to him, because if you go back to the Old Testament, and I won't flip there today, but you could actually read in the book of Exodus, starting in chapter 31, and go all the way through chapter 37. And guess what is happening there? God is giving Moses the instructions for building the tabernacle. He's talking about building the altar, building the implements, building the walls, the tapestries that will be woven. And yes, he even talks about the priest's garments that will be sewn. And what God says to Moses is, I will put my spirit of wisdom on the artisans, and they will do all that I command you. I'm kind of summarizing all those chapters down. But what God is saying, when you look up the original Hebrew word for that, in that passage, the word wisdom, skill. God is going to give the people the skill they need to do everything to accomplish the tabernacle. And we know later on, when David is king and he collects all the materials, the people gratefully, joyfully bring all the materials for the building of the temple, and Solomon one day builds that. The detail, the description of what they're putting together, and all that skill came from God. So whether you know it or not, or whether any person know it or not, skill comes from God. And you can do it unto yourself for your own glory, or you can do it for the glory of God and give him all praise and all thanks for what you accomplish. In fact, on my wall, we have a giant scripture, and that is from Exodus 28:2. And this is in particular where God is telling Moses how to make the priest's garments. And God says, and you shall do this for glory and for beauty. And that is my tagline. That is on my sewing label. It is why I do what I do. And I promise you that having that scripture on our wall is probably one of the greatest reasons that we have a thriving business here. If you are raising a banner that honors God in your business, He's going to be happy to bring people in the door. And from the moment we open these doors, a couple of slow steps in the beginning, but once people got the word out that we were here, we've never looked back. In fact, I have to say no a lot. I have too much business, and I give God all the praise and glory for that. So that is why we are here, and that is why I do what I do. It's fun, it's satisfying, it saves me money, I make money, and it's biblical. Now, if you were with us for our first episode, episode 1, you know that I showed how to make a certain pattern, a pattern you know will fit, by using your own clothing. If you didn't see that one, please go back and check it out, and I explain it and lay it all out for you, how to use your own clothes for that perfect fit. Today, I promised you that I was going to use one of those that I had taken apart and sew with you today. So having everything cut and prepped, we are now going to begin putting this shirt together. When you sew, if you use a commercial pattern, they're going to tell you step 1, step 2, step 3. Because I rarely use a commercial pattern anymore, I do know that the first step you want to do is getting your components ready. And what do I mean by components? Well, your components are your cuffs, your collar, your bands, anything that you are going to be putting together separately that will be added to the large pieces of fabric. And by the way, just wanted to say, this is really funny, but I intend on being honest with you. I made this after the first episode from my tunic shirt that I showed you, and I was so excited about adding a little red to my wardrobe that I put the buttonholes on the wrong side. Oops. And guess what? I left it. And that is my little joke, my little inside joke with me, that Jackie, you're not perfect. And none of us are. And so I want to tell you right now, let me just take a moment and say, if you are thinking you're going to sit down and create the perfect product, that's likely to not happen, especially for the first many times you sit and sew. But that's okay. We're going to throw the word perfection away. And what we're going to use instead is a word called excellence. Excellence is my favorite word when I teach sewing and when I sit down to produce something myself, because excellence means at the level of your ability, you're going to do your best. And if you're just starting out and you make a mistake, you'll take that seam ripper and pop it apart and put it back together again. And you're going to do that until you get your finished product. And when you put it on, you may think, oh, it doesn't look like what she made. It doesn't look like what I saw in Kohl's department store. No, but at the level of your ability, you have done your best work. And how we get better and how we refine our skills is by just doing it over and over and over, our level best at every level. So obviously, I've been sewing for 50 years now, and guess what? I made a boo-boo, but I wear that boo-boo proudly because it humbles me, and I remember I'm not perfect. By the way, one quick note. Do you know why the buttonholes are on different sides for men and women? It's not even relevant today. Way back in time past, when the ladies had ladies to help them dress, the women's buttonholes were on the right because a lady was standing in front of them, buttoning for them. And it was easier for them to button if the buttonholes were on the right-hand side. So today we keep up that tradition, but it really means nothing. All right, so that's my little honesty, that's my little confession, and I hope it encourages you. So I did some pre-prepping at the ironing board, and if you notice, the first thing I mark on my top is the darts. I took pins and placed them strategically at different points in the dart, and then I took a marker which will disappear when I put the iron to it. You can use a pencil. You just want to be very careful to always mark on the wrong side of the fabric and use something that's not going to bleed through when you do that. Pins are very good. Also, you could just pin it out. For me, that takes a little time. After that, I pressed in 1/8 of an inch on all of my seams, my shoulder seams, my side seams, because that will be the first seam finish that I show you. There's many ways to finish seams. We don't leave them raw. I left them raw for a lot of years because I had nobody to tell me you need to finish those. Well, raw is not good. Raw frays out and wears out. So this is the first seam finish I'm going to demonstrate to you today. There will be other ones with future projects. After that, I pressed over the front edges, which will become my button placket and my buttonhole placket. And you better hope that I remember to put those buttonholes on the right-hand side. I will try. So having done all of that prep, what we're going to do now is begin to sew. I've got my sewing machine, my beautiful 1951 Singer, all threaded up with a thread that mostly matches my background color. In a multicolored fabric, you can pick whatever you want. You could do a contrasting color for detail, but on this project, I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to begin by simply sewing that 1/8 inch fold over on the seam. Lifting my presser foot, I'm not going to backstitch. Backstitching is when you want to lock. It doesn't matter on this application. My stitch length is set at a good construction inch, depending on, on a good construction length, depending on the sewing machine that you are working on. If you have a modern machine, probably 2.5 to 3 is the number you're looking for. You don't want it overly long. That's too loose and it won't have a nice finish, and too little is going to frustrate you. It'll take forever to sew and it'll be nearly impossible to pick out if you make a mistake. So somewhere in the middle between basting and fine, you'll find your regular construction stitch. Now, I start by holding my bobbin thread and my top thread in my hand to keep them from boogering up. They will not. And it doesn't matter if you're closer to the folded edge or in the middle here. You see I'm putting a little pressure. Once I get it started, I can let go, and I'm a neatnik. I clip as I go. I do not like hanging threads. It's a good habit to form. And now I'm going to put my left hand behind with my right hand in front, and I'm just putting even tension. I'm not pulling. The machine is doing all the work. You go at the speed that you are comfortable with. Modern machines usually have different speeds. You can adjust with a flip of a switch, but if you're accustomed to a little bit of sewing, just put the pedal down. There's nothing magical about this. So we're just going to go all the way around all of our pieces, doing the same thing. Take those threads in hand. It just, believe me, it matters. The first time you get this all knotted up, And you might think, well, it's on the inside, nobody's going to see it. But everything adds thickness and adds weight. And little things like that do add up. So again, excellence, okay? It isn't complicated. It is a process. All right, I've got that one done. And you see, I'm just flipping things around here at the machine. I know where I'm headed. And obviously, it's going to take you a little longer if you haven't done this before. Remember what I said in the first episode, I talked to you about leaving part of your original garment intact. You can always use that as a guide to go back and say, now, what should I be doing next? And honestly, it's just a learned thing as you go. Nobody's going to sit down the first time and make a top in 2 hours. Once you've been doing it for a while, you can make 3 or 4 tops in an afternoon. That's called being smart and cutting everything out at the same time. Maybe even using fabrics that you don't have to change your color of thread. Little tips and tricks like that, and you can make multiple garments in one day. Now you see that I did pre-press these, as I said before. If I weren't doing a video on this, I probably wouldn't have even pre-pressed them. I would have just sat down but I want to show you, I want you to have success. And so I take a little extra time and do things I have forgotten how to do. And finally, our big back piece. We've got our 2 front sections. Also, I am not doing pockets. You know, this is a pretty busy print. It's an all over print, lots of colors. I find that the busier the print, the more simple I want the design. I'm not going to put a lot of doodads and bells and whistles. I wouldn't do, well, I won't say that, but pockets I don't feel are necessary on this, especially on a top. I'm not putting pens and pencils in my pocket. They're more decorative, so on this one I feel comfortable. It doesn't need that detail. Now, if you want to sew with a nice solid, that's where I get into lots of detail. I like to do tucks. I like to do pockets. To tell you the truth, I love the look of a beautiful stitch. There's nothing prettier than after sewing to gaze at those little stitches nestled sweetly in the textile. Just something very pretty about it. And maybe everybody doesn't feel the same way, but I love it. Now I'm going to talk to you about pressing. You see that in this shot, I've moved my ironing board close to me at my right-hand side. That's because of economy of motion. It speeds everything up. It's okay if you don't have room to slide your ironing board next to you, that it's right there, then get up and walk to your ironing board, because your iron is very important in getting a beautiful finished result. You know, you don't have to be a professional to sew like a professional. And I think that's one of the reasons I love doing this for you, to teach you all the little tips and tricks that I use even for my clients. Because believe me, when I talk about making mistakes, there's no mistakes going out that door when somebody is paying me. I want to be clear about that. When I make a mistake on my own garment, I live with it and I chuckle. But when people are paying me real money to do something, that seam ripper comes out as many times as it needs to until I do my best work for them. I believe I owe it to them. So One of the things that will give you finished professional looks is press, press, press. If you think if you hate ironing, I'm sorry, you're not going to be a very successful sewer. Even when we're just doing the seam allowance. And if you notice, I'm using a regular domestic iron, nothing fancy. I bought 3 commercial irons in the last 6 years and they all petered out on me and I'm done with them. What I did do is find a domestic with lots of steam vents. Steam is very important in this, so I have the same iron at home for doing my own clothing. Just set it on for a moment, give a shot of steam, and what that is doing is it's setting the thread further into the, or deeper I should say, into the textile, and it makes a difference. So we do all of these. But you can see how much time it saves having the ironing board right by me. Also, my chair, it's worth it to have a good chair. A chair on wheels is nice, and a chair that swivels. If you don't have a chair on wheels or a chair that swivels, that's okay. I sewed at my dining room table for years. For years, I made all of my clothes and my children's clothes by sitting at the dining room table. That. And that. Now, from here, I can either begin to put my collar pieces together or I can do my darts. You know what? I think what I'll do is start with my collar pieces. Let's talk about interfacing. Most commercial patterns will recommend that you use a fusible interfacing, and what fusible is an iron-on. You cut a piece out a little bit larger than your fabric piece, and then you take it to the ironing board and press to, and it adheres. I don't like fusible interfacing. I don't like a lot of bulk, and that even the lightweight tend to make things a little thick, a little thicker than what I like them. So I've cut my top and bottom collar pieces out, and underneath on the wrong side I put a piece of lightweight cotton gauze, and I've even used cheesecloth. If you use cheesecloth, you do want to wet it in the sink and throw it in the dryer, pre-shrink it. This is just gauze fabric, and that reminds me, I do pre-shrink my wovens, such as cotton, that I know will shrink. As much as I'm able, I save time by putting things in the washing machine. And if you plan on doing that and using the dryer, you want to pre-shrink your fabric. So what does that mean? It means get them wet and throw them in the dryer. Now, let's talk about pins. Mr. Happy Snowman here. I don't really pin that much, but I'm going to talk to you about pins because pins do help when you are a beginner or a frustrated sewer. There's different ways to put pins in, and there are reasons why you might sometimes want to put them in like this. And by like this, I mean running parallel with the edge of your fabric. I don't like to do that because it kind of slows things down. What I do is put them horizontally, and if you've got to use 20 pins to hold everything in place for you, then you use 20 pins. If you only need 2, then use 2. And if you don't need any, don't use any. The pins are just to help hold things in the proper place so that when you're finished sewing, and in this case turning your collar right side out, you're going to have the effect you're looking for. So a couple of tips on corners. Well, let's just start at the beginning. You notice I don't have any lines for my seam allowance. That's because I've been doing this a long time. My eyeball knows. On this particular shirt, I think I allowed for a 1/2 inch-ish, 5/8 inch seam allowance. So my eyeball knows where that is. If your eyeball doesn't know, you may have lines on the side of your throat plate that tell you where, and you will just follow the edge of your fabric on that line and you'll have a nice even straight line seam as you sew. I also have used painter's tape. This one doesn't have lines, and there are times when I need a good guide, and just take a piece of blue painter's tape and measure it out, put it down, and keep the edge of your fabric on that, and you will have straight, nice seams. But I'm going to put in at about 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to go in from this edge about 1/4 inch, and there's a reason for that. I drop my needle right there, put my presser foot down, holding those threads. I go in reverse, and I just hand turn my wheel. Don't need to put it on the, regulating. It's like driving a car. It's a learned thing, how much pressure. So when you want to go really slow, just turn your wheel by hand. And now I go forward, and I have made a lock stitch, and that's not going to come out. When I get to my pin, pull it out. Don't be lazy and drive over it. You could destroy the timing on your machine. If that needle hits the pin, that could be a big repair bill. All right, I'm ready to go. But one more thing, we're getting close to a corner. I'm going to drop my stitch length down tinier the closer I get, and that will ensure, but I was turning the wheel by hand. It's no fair if I don't follow my own rules, right? So when I get to 5/8 of an inch from this edge, my needle is in, I lift my presser foot and turn. Leave your needle in when you turn. And keeping that smaller stitch, I start up, and now I can make it a little bigger, and we just tootle right along. Again, if you put a little even pressure, that way things don't gather on you. As much as possible, if you're in the process of sewing, stop with your needle in your fabric. That way you're always guaranteed, I'm going to turn that, you're always guaranteed to start up in the last place you stopped. And now I drop my stitch length, approaching my corner, boom, boom, boom. One more. Lift. Start up small and increase. And now I get to my finish at my 3rd edge, boom. Back up. And yes, I did overcut my gauze, my interfacing. If you cut your interfacing to size, things can shift. Even when you pin, things can shift. So I just leave it oversized, and then we trim it away. And this is not rocket science here. This is nothing you have to be so scared of getting really perfect. Just lop it off. Now, when it comes to our corner here, let me show you. our tiny little stitches right at our corner. We're going to turn this right side out, I should say. When we turn it right side out, we've got a lot of fabric here which can bulk up. So what I'm going to do, keep a garbage can next to you, always. I'm going to fold on my stitches. I'm going to slightly trim. Okay, I'm about 1/8 of an inch away from my point stitch here. Trim a little bit off. Now fold it on the stitch line. Fold it on the stitch line. And now, pinching it, take your good thumb, push it right up as far as you can in that corner, and turn. I like to keep a blunted chopstick next to me. It's one of my handy dandy tools. And now you can push that out beautifully. I'm going to do it again on the other end to make sure you see. Here's my stitches, and here's my point of my collar. So about 1/8 of an inch away. Okay, so having trimmed that little diagonal piece off, now I've lessened the seam allowance that'll be inside, lessened the bulk, and I fold on my stitches, fold on my stitches, give a little thumb press, pinching it in my right hand because I am right-handed. I'm going to open it up, put a finger inside as far up into that corner as I can, and now pushing and turning at the same time. Take my little chopstick and push. Beautiful. And guess what I'm going to do next? I'm going to press it. So I'm going to take it over to my ironing board, press that seam allowance to one side, get up there in the, and I won't steam, but I'll just do a little press like so, because we want everything to line up nicely. So now it lays right on that seam. You can finger press it. If you don't press it open first, you're going to get this is not going to be accurate. It won't be as crisp and nice. And remember, we're sewing for excellence here, so we take extra steps. We don't want to waste time, but we don't want to skip steps that will make it beautiful. Now, you wonder why I haven't trimmed that away yet, because that happens now. I like to make sure that my collar points are the same size. It's hard to see, but there's just a little bit more on this side. So folding it in half with these edges on top of each other. Take my scissor and cut. And now I know that my collar is going to be symmetrical. Boom. Let's talk about a little extra step here. A little added detail is top stitching. and I do love top stitching. On this particular collar, it doesn't matter which is the top and which is the bottom. Actually, this sewing machine sews a very nice balanced tension, so when I go to put it all together, it won't matter which side is up or down. I am right next to the edge, and that's why it's called edge stitching. Take my little threads, and with a construction stitch length, construction stitch length, so right up, turn that wheel to get right, boom, where you want it, at the very edge. Needle down, you turn, and make sure that that seam is laying exactly right, and go again. I did overpress just a tad on that. You can always adjust it as you go. I mentioned before that I am mostly self-taught, and it's one of my motivators for doing these for you. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of nitty-gritty on how to do exact technical things, because there's about 50 million YouTube videos right now that you can go to for that kind of detailed instruction. I'm here more to inspire you to create and show you the quick and helpful tips. I want you to also know that you do not have to finish a garment in one sitting. Absolutely not required. If you are busy with a job, busy with a family, just a busy person, but you still have a desire to sew, you see that I press that. Set those stitches in that fabric. It makes a difference. And there's my outer collar. In a half an hour, you can have your collar all together and ready to go. You could have your seams finished and ready to go. Okay, now the collar band. We're going to find the center. Again, I'm going to tell you, if you want to really, really learn how to put a collar together, just type it into YouTube and you will find the detailed instruction. I just put a little clip in the centers because you definitely want the centers lined up. Little tiny. Just makes a V. Okay. Here's my V. Okay. And now, lining up my center points, my V's. I will put some pins. On the topic of pins, if you notice, I have different colored pins in my pin cushion because these, which I lovingly call harpoons, the bigger pins, they're fine on sturdier wovens, like use those for denims and such, and this is a mid-weight cotton woven, so it's fine. My little white pins are silk pins, and they're not necessarily just for silk, but they are for finer fabrics, like when I work on my wedding gowns. I don't want to use my harpoon. And you notice when I'm pinning, my item is flat on the table. Don't lift and pin because you're not going to pin accurately. And you see how I'm going a little bit at a time? That's because there is a curve in there. I kind of updated my shirt pattern when I cut this one out. If you notice the shape of the collar band, and that, what I'm talking about, this is your collar band right here. I like to square it rather than round it, which is more traditional, but I like the look of the squared collar band, and it's a little easier to sew to get them identical on both sides. So I've got one collar band on the bottom, and now I don't need to mark this one because I'm just going to line it up like so. This is a little bit more persnickety. With the curve, you have to take the time. Making sure I've got these ends correct. And no, I'm not pinning my interfacing. The interfacing is going to go, let me tell you, interface your collars. Even if it's really lightweight, interface your collars because they'll flop on you. They'll just, they won't stand properly. So now that I've done that, I'm just going to lay this over. And yes, it's oversized, just as I said before. Whoop. Okay, now, whoops. Not necessarily easy doing this talking, you know. I do much better when I'm by myself, but it's less fun too. Okay, I got my edges lined up. Now, again, I'm starting 1/4 of an inch in. This is my little personal technique. I'm dropping my stitch length down, down, down. I'm not going to do a backwards lock stitch, but dropping the stitch length to teeny weeny should lock it. And the reason is I don't want a lot of bulk there. Where I'm sewing right now on this is right here, where this is going to join to the front edge of the shirt, and I don't want a lot of bulk there. So with a teeny tiny stitch, that's as good as doing a reverse stitch. I am going by the seam allowances that I cut according to that original shirt pattern. Most always on commercial patterns, they will give you 5/8 of an inch on everything. You'll be sewing 5/8 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch. I'm just going by what I know worked on, not quite there, on the original. Okay, now, I'm going to keep that little tiny stitch because I'm at a corner, and once I do about 4 or 5, now I can go to regular stitch length. I'll pull the first one out of the way there, and I am eyeballing a nice even 1/2 inch. The bigger the seam allowance that you allow in your garment, the more room you have to adjust it. If you happen to gain a little weight, you don't have to throw it away. In couture sewing, they mostly use 1 inch seam allowances, and that's very hard for me. I really, really want to get into the habit of that, but it's so ingrained in me to do 5/8 or 1/2 inch. And the reason they do that is because it can be adjusted easily. One thing that drives me nuts about men's clothing versus women's Manufactured wear is they always give you extra fabric in the rear seam of a man's pant, and with women, no. So I have men coming in all the time asking me to let their pants out. But if a lady comes in and asks, I'm sorry ma'am, there's not enough seam allowance there. Maybe you can try and match the fabric and let them out, make a gusset. But okay, just like before, trim off that extra. This is a curve, so we clip our curves. And by clip, we are doing little snips, depending on, this isn't a massive curve, so about 1 inch apart and halfway in. What this does is when you turn the piece right side out, it allows room for the fabric to expand. Like before, carefully clip. Carefully clip. You know why? Because you'll make a boo-boo and you'll have to make a whole brand new one, which you will do. If you do that, you get to work and you make a new band. Don't you throw this away because you made one little boo-boo. My mom and I were talking the other day on the phone, and I was telling her about doing this. And I said, Mom, do you remember how my closet in my bedroom was full of unfinished dresses and skirts? And she said, oh yes. And I said, boy, it was the best day of my life when I picked up a seam ripper and learned to take things apart and redo them. You'll never get better chucking something and starting a new project. Okay, I folded in on my corner stitches like before. And now I push and turn like so. Fold, fold. I learned this trick from an 83-year-old tailor. I worked for her for a little bit, and any learning that I did by other people, it was mostly because of jobs I had. I like to take sewing jobs because I could learn more about sewing from people who had a little more knowledge than me. So I learned that trick from a crazy, crazy lady. That was a trip, quite an experience, but she was brilliant in what she did. Pull the bottom out and press. Whoop. We're setting those stitches. And getting that exactly. And remember, I top stitch this edge before I put it into the band. If you forget that step, oh, I didn't do the tops or the edge stitching, that's okay. You can get away with it and do it afterwards, but it just looks nicer. And the final test is to take it, fold it in half, and everything lines up. Beautiful. I'm not going to worry about that little scrapper. That's going to be taken care of. We have a collar component set. So now with our collar complete, We set that aside with our big pieces. One more thing we're going to do today, and then we're going to call it quits for this episode. We're going to pick it up again next time, and we will complete our garment, the good Lord willing. So our last thing I want to show you in prepping for the finish is the bias cut strips that I previously cut. And these are going to be our armhole finish on our sleeveless blouse. I've cut several and I just guesstimated the length. These are cut on the bias. I'll talk more about that next week. Laying one strip with the right side up, horizontal. We take the other strip right side down, vertical. And we lay those edges together. If you need to, you can put a pin. And why are we doing this? Well, you're going to see in just a minute. Maybe a little bit of mystery will help you return for the next one. I've got a smaller stitch length, and I'm putting my needle in, setting it, hold these threads, and slowly move toward the other side. Boom. And I can back it. There we go. Just tiny little back stitch. Not a lot necessary. Now, I'm going to do that with all 4 of these pieces. And you see the end result? When you cut these ends on a miter and put them together, you get one long strip of bias. And see what that has? It's like elastic. It's got built-in stretch. And you're going to need that when we come back next time to put this around our edge hole. So I hope today you were encouraged. I hope today you were inspired. I hope today you learned a little bit about maybe not being so worried about perfection. And never forget that it's God that gives you the skill, whether you know it or not. And if you use this skill and ask God to increase your skill, I promise you He is waiting to do that. You have a great day, and I will see you when I see you next time. God bless.